So welcome back to week 5 of our podcast, where we're wrapping up our unit on rhythm and pitch. Last week we finished up rhythm, talking about syncopation as well as tempo. And now we're moving on to pitch. Today we're hoping to cover things like some basic intervals, a couple basic scales, and a little bit of information about scales and instruments. We won't have any listening examples this week outside of maybe just a few notes here or there to illustrate some points. So with no further ado, let's jump into week 5, pitch. Music, as we noted in our first episode, generally does not use the total continuous range of musical sounds. Instead, it draws on only a limited number of fixed pitches. These pitches can be assembled in a collection called a scale. In effect, a scale is the pool of pitches available for making music. Which exact pitches constitute a scale differ from culture to culture. 12 basic pitches have been fixed for most of the music we know, and so people tend to think of the Western scale as natural. This is a mistake. 5 pitches were once used in Japan. As many as 24 have been used in Near Eastern countries, and Western Europe itself originally only used 7. Our first interval, the octave. The difference or distance between any two pitches is called an interval. Of the many different intervals used in music, one has a special character that makes it particularly important. This is the octave. If a series of successive pitches is sounded, one after another, say, running up the white keys of the piano, there comes a point at which the pitch seems, in some sense, to duplicate an earlier pitch, but at a higher level. This new pitch does not sound identical to the old one, but somehow the two sounds are very similar. They blend extremely well. They almost seem to melt into each other. What causes the phenomenon of octaves? Recall from our first episode that when strings vibrate to produce sound, they vibrate in partials. That is, not only along their full length, but also in halves and other fractions. A vibrating string that is half as long as another will reinforce the latter's strongest partial. This reinforcement causes the duplication effect of octaves. As strings go, so go vocal cords. When men and women sing together, they automatically sing in octaves, duplicating each other's singing an octave or 2 apart. If you ask them, they will say they are singing the same tune. Not many will think of adding at different octave levels. As a result of the phenomenon of octaves, the full continuous range of pitches that exists in nature, and that is covered, for example, by a siren starting low and going up higher and higher, falls into a series of duplicating segments. Human ears are able to detect about 10 of these octave segments. 2 or 3 octaves is a normal range for most voices and instruments. A large pipe organ covers all 10. A piano covers about 7. 2 octaves are shown in this diagram for our next topic of the diatonic scale. The diatonic scale. The set of 7 pitches originally used in Western music is called the diatonic scale. Dating from ancient Greek times, it is still used today. When the first of the 7 pitches is replaced at a higher duplicate pitch, the total is 8. Hence the name octave, meaning 8 span. Anyone who knows the series Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do is at home with the diatonic scale. You can count out the octave for yourself, starting with the first Do as 1 and ending with the second Do as 8. The set of white keys on the piano, or other keyboards, constitute the scale, shown as a keyboard and diatonic scale notes running through 2 octaves, marked with their conventional letter names. The Chromatic Scale. The diatonic scale was the original, basic scale of Western music. At a later period, 5 more pitches were added between certain of the 7 members of the diatonic scale, making a total of 12. This is the Chromatic Scale, represented by the complete set of white and black keys on a keyboard. However, the Chromatic Scale did not make the diatonic scale obsolete. For centuries, until about 1920, the composers used the Chromatic Scale freely while still favoring the diatonic scale that is embedded in it. Our keyboards still reflect this, with their chromatic notes colored differently from the diatonic ones, set black and thinner. On medieval church organs, designed to accommodate the diatonic scale only, the keyboards had no black notes, or at most just 1. These extra pitches caused a problem for musical notation. The pitches of the diatonic scale are indicated on the lines and spaces of the staff. There are no positions in between, so symbols were introduced. B flat stands for B flat, the pitch inserted between A and B. C with the hashtag beside it stands for C sharp, the pitch between C and D, and so on. Intervals, half steps, and whole steps. As previously noted, the difference or distance between any 2 pitches is called the interval between them. Look at the chromatic scale. Besides the C to C octave interval marked with a bracket, 11 other kinds of intervals exist between C and the other notes of the scale. For our purposes, only 2 additional interval types need to be considered. The smallest interval is the half step, or semitone, which is the distance between any 2 successive notes of the chromatic scale. Step is a name for small interval. On a keyboard, a half step is the interval between the closest adjacent notes. The distance from E to F is a half step. So is the distance from F to F sharp, G to A flat, and so on. As the smallest interval in regular use, the half step is also the smallest that most people can hear easily and identify. Many tunes, such as the Battle Hymn of the Old Republic, end with 2 half steps, 1 half step going down and the same one going up. His truth is marching on. The whole step, or whole tone, is equivalent to 2 half steps, D to E, E to F sharp, F sharp to G sharp, and so on. The song 3 Blind Mice starts with 2 whole steps going down. 3 blind mice, 3 blind mice. The chromatic scale consists exclusively of half steps. Therefore, this scale can be described as symmetrical in the sense that one can start on any of its pitches and sing up or down the scale by half steps with exactly the same effect as if one started anywhere else. The diatonic scale is not symmetrical in this sense. It includes both half steps and whole steps. Between B and C and between E and F, the interval is a half step. But between the other pairs of adjacent notes, the interval is twice as big, a whole step. Music is made out of these scales, and the diatonic and chromatic scales differ in the intervals between their constituent pitches. Hence the importance of intervals. In this diagram, the two scales are lined up in order to show the differences in their interval structure. Scales and instruments. Until fairly recently, Western music used the 12 pitches of the chromatic scale, duplicated through all the octaves, and in principle no other pitches. Features of many instruments are designed to produce these particular pitches exactly. Frets on guitars, carefully measured holes on flutes, and the turned sets of strings of harps and pianos. Other instruments, such as the violin and the slide trombone, have a more continuous range of pitches available to them, as does the police siren or the human voice.
Wow!
In mastering these instruments, one of the first tasks is learning to pick out exactly the right pitches. This is called playing in tune. Singing in tune is a matter of constant concern for vocalists as well. It's true that many instruments and all singers regularly perform certain notes slightly out of tune for important and legitimate artistic effects. Blue notes in jazz are an example. However, these off pitches are only small, temporary deviations from the main pitches of the scale, the same 12 pitches that, on instruments such as the piano, are absolutely fixed. And with that, we come to a close in our 5th episode of our podcast. Next week, we are jumping into structures of music. We've talked about the very foundations of just simply sound and time in our first 2 episodes. In the last 3, we focused on rhythm and pitch. And now we're going to talk about things including melody, harmony, texture, tonality, and modality as well. We're about halfway through the first section of our podcast on just sort of the fundamentals of music, and we'll shortly be jumping into history and early music. Very, very exciting. So with that, we'll see you next week, and have a great musical adventure. Bye-bye.